Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, our Laboratories Perpetuating Data Integrity Problems, presented by Paul Smith and Bob Mcdowell. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature and we'll have a QA section at the end. After we're done today, I'll send out a copy of the slides as well as answers to all the questions we receive and a recording of today's presentation. Before we begin, I would like to quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Taylor Minks, and I am the marketing lead at Redica Systems. Redica Systems is a technology company using data, analytics, and expertise to deliver meaningful insights to quality and safety professionals around the world. By applying artificial intelligence to large and disparate government data sets, Redica Systems empowers its customers to improve compliance, increase product quality, and build a more efficient organization. Founded in 2010, Redica Systems serves over 200 customers in the pharma, medical device, and food industries, including 19 of the top 20 pharma companies and 9 of the top 10 medical device companies. Today's presenter, Paul Smith, has a passion for laboratory compliance. He started his career as an infrared spectroscopist, interpreting FTIR and Raman spectra and applying chemometric modeling tools to the data. His first software validation work was in 1992, before moving into broader analytical chemistry, project, and laboratory management roles. In his current role at Agilent Technologies, he monitors laboratory compliance, change, and non-compliance trends, regulatory contributing and writing journal articles related to laboratory compliance, and analytical instrument qualification. Our second presenter, Bob Mcdowell, is an analytical chemist with 50 years of experience, including 15 years working in the pharmaceutical industry, followed by 29 years working for the industry as a consultant. He has over 35 years of experience in automating laboratories and computerized systems, maintaining involving analytical systems and laboratory informatics. Bob edited the first book on laboratory information management systems in 1987, and he is the 1997 LIMS awardee for the LIMS Institute presented for advances in training and subject. Bob was also the co-author of the draft for the current version of USP 1058 on analytical instrument qualification that integrated instrument qualification and computerized system validation effective from 2008. Bob has also been involved with the validation and computerized systems for over 35 years and is the author of Validation of Chromatography Data Systems, second edition published in 2017. His latest book is Data Integrity and Data Governance, Practical Implementation for Regulated Laboratories that was published in 2009 by the Royal Society of Chemistry. Again, if you have any questions today, please put them in the chat or Q&A feature. And now I'll pass it over to Paul and Bob to begin today's webinar.
Thanks, Taylor, and welcome everyone. I'll have my camera on just to say hello and for the introduction, and then I'll turn it off as we start presenting.
Hi, I'm Bob. Just to say thank you for listening, and over to Paul.
Thanks, Bob. So we're covering data integrity, and the theme that people or laboratories may be perpetuating problems with data integrity, and that's a theme that we'll go over again and again. Thank you for that detailed introduction, Taylor. We do have a slide with some high-level bullet points around Bob and myself. So I did start off as a spectroscopist, so having infrared as an example, but it's not the only analytical technique is welcome. And Bob started off as a chromatographer and is now a very experienced consultant. The things that we're going to cover in this webinar are shown in this contents page. And this contents page we actually have shown several times so that we can show progress. The green subjects are the subjects that I will lead and Bob will contribute, and the blue ones are ones which Bob will lead and I may contribute. So we're going to start off with an introduction to set the scene, and I'm going to cover some data integrity trend information, some at a high level, some more detailed, and there's some key learning points within that. Purchasing software with adequate data integrity controls is another fundamental key, and the regulatory troubles and the examples and poor working practices, which Bob is going to cover in much more detail, reinforce that message. Then we're going to highlight the essentials that people need to do for improving. And then at the end, we'll have a couple of summary slides before we move into the Q&A. Anything you want to add to the contents and the introduction, Bob?
No, I think we're good to go.
Okay, excellent. One of the documents that we'll reference several times in this presentation is the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, or PICS, Data Integrity Guidance, which was updated and released last year. And this is one of the more fundamental data integrity guidance documents. And within this presentation, we will be returning to this slide and different aspects of it to reinforce some of the information. The key components are that purchase of any computerized system in a regulatory environment, the supplier has to understand the data integrity and GXP requirements and develop software containing technical controls to ensure data integrity and GXP compliance. And that's a theme that we'll go back to. Regulators generally are much more interested in organizations moving away from procedural control around documents to implementing technical solutions with technical controls. And that's something that we'll come back to again. So what I want to do is just remind everybody of the contents. And in the next slide, I'm going to start talking around some examples of data integrity trends. And that's going to show on this page now. One of the problems we've had is that we've had a pandemic, and one of the consequences of that pandemic is it's been significantly reduced or zero on-site audits. So these two trending graphs go up to and including the start of the pandemic. But one of the things we have to be mindful of is if we try and look at trend data when we've had periods where regulators weren't doing on-site audits, they did remote audits, then some of the findings that we can pull out here today, they may not, but there may be a spell where that data is not available. These show two of the strongest historical trends in FDA warning letters. The graph on the right shows the trend of warning letters related to data integrity. And you'll see that that's linear with quite a high correlation coefficient up until and including 2020. Whereas the graph on the left covers a narrower period, only 5 years compared to 10, and that is around warning letters that mention out of specification or use within them. Very clear areas of FDA focus. The two images you see now are representations of two documents, an FDA warning letter or an FDA Form 483. FDA warning letters are all in the public domain, whereas the FDA only make available limited examples of 483s. FDA warning letters typically are written at a high level, whereas if you're interested in the laboratory, there's typically more laboratory detail in the Form 483. Warning letters focus on data integrity, out of specifications, and one of the more recent trends is an increasing expansion of remediation actions and things laboratories have to do in order to be considered compliant after they receive a warning letter. So Form 483s contain different information from warning letters, and that gives us two take-homes. One is that data integrity and out of specification, the requirements of those apply to everything the lab does, but they also apply to instrument qualification as well as sample analysis. And you need to not just to look at warning letters, which are on the FDA page, you need to really explore how to access 483s and other documents such as an establishment inspection report. So I'll move on to another example. And this is an establishment inspection report, or part of one. And just to clarify, the FDA issue a Form 483 at the end of the audit, and it's a high-level summary, but it's not a complete report of the audit, and it's not the concluding actions. The organization that receives the audit will receive an establishment inspection report from the FDA, and it's a very detailed explanation of everything that happened in the audit. Now, you can access these through the Freedom of Information, or you can access through them other services such as Redica. This is an excerpt from an EIR, Establishment Inspection Report, from November last year. And it's interesting, this is highlighting that during the audit, the FDA looked at the HPLC qualification of 2 instruments in detail. Now, in this example, there were no deficiencies noted, so it's unlikely the fact that they're looking at this would be found outside of the EIR, but it is worth noting, and it does reinforce the message that if you're looking for the truth around what's happening in the regulatory space, you're going to have to look beyond warning letters. Now, one of the things that I need to address is people may ask, well, why do you focus on the FDA? And although other regulatory non-compliance data is available, by an order of maybe as much as 100 or more, the FDA make more non-compliance data available. It's just the simple fact there's much more data. So I want to talk a little bit around the triangle on the left. This is called the data quality triangle, and I'm going to cover this on the next few slides. If you add a foundation layer to that triangle, that foundation layer becomes the data governance. If an organization or laboratory doesn't have data governance that's good or strong, then in principle, everything above it becomes at risk. And one of the questions auditors sometimes ask is, they might ask to see your data governance policy. And if you don't even have a policy document on it, then it tells them that in terms of data integrity maturance, you're probably quite behind the times. The next layer of the triangle is the analytical instrument qualification layer, and this is the analytical foundation for good quality data. The yellow layer, as I've colored it, is really around the analytical method or analytical procedure, as it's now called in USP 1058. And that's about the suitability of the procedure. It's about validating the procedure or the method and defining within that validation things like system suitability. And we may cover more on this later. The top 2 layers are covered in green because those are things which represent things you do at the point of use. And that includes system suitability checks and QT checks, etc. So I want to look at the triangle a little bit more. And this time I'm going to turn it upside down and I'm going to expand it. Now, through the magic of PowerPoint, I can overlay these colors. And I'm doing this to represent the fact that because of the focus on data integrity that's happened, auditors are looking, and it's global, it's not just the FDA, all agencies are looking in this space. They look at that foundation layer first before they get into maybe the qualification or the method or the detail below it. One of the questions that's important is if an auditor finds data integrity issues, the audit focuses on that because they want to know if fraud occurred in the laboratory. And that's an interesting question from a trending perspective because historically, the FDA would report in a warning letter if they found evidence of fraud. Now they're more likely to report that the systems, such as the technical controls, didn't prevent fraud. They didn't prevent people deleting data, or even a lab manager having administration rights to some software. So the situation has evolved. I want to look at the impact of this focus. I'm going to use HPLC as an example. So I used to do a lot of analysis of HPLC related warning letter and GC. And although this is a historical graph, I'm using it to make the point that as warning letters started to include, and this graph represents the percentage of HPLC related FDA warning letters issued each year that included these subjects. And as data integrity started to dominate, you'll see that the other technical information subjects decreased. So if you're only looking at warning letters, you may think you only have to address data integrity and not method validation, qualification, etc. So that's a significant trend. And because of this upside down pyramid, that they look at the foundation, they look at data integrity, even though qualification and software validation are very important, certainly in the qualification and method space, this upside down focus has resulted in fewer warning letters or observations than you might expect for qualification or analytical methods or procedures. I just want to move on to talk a little bit around this base again, and I'll make some space and move it up. In simple terms, an auditor is going to evaluate the integrity of everything your lab does. And they're going to evaluate that against 2 things: the scientific and regulatory validity of the work you're performing, and the data integrity of how the work was done and documented. Now, how well that experience goes has a contribution from your ability to understand those subjects, explain those subjects, and essentially defend them during an audit. And that's a skill. And I encourage people to continue to find out more knowledge and information about this subject. Fundamentally, the things that you're going to have to respond to in the audit, the questions you're going to have to answer are going to be about, is the instrument suitable for your intended use, for the method you're running, for the limits you're setting, for the maximum and minimum? Are the methods or procedures you're running suitable for the decisions you're making on that data? Is the software controlling the instrument validated for intended use? And do you have a data integrity foundation? As I said before, some auditors would actually ask to see a data governance policy when they arrived on site. So we're going to show you another trend graph, and this one is around looking for the prevalence of the term contemporaneous, which is one of the ALCOA terms, within FDA warning letters. And you see there's a large period of history where this wasn't something the FDA included in warning letters. And then you see it trend up and come down and now go up again. Now, if I join the dots, you get this trend. And as part of this kind of analysis, you'll see there are two contributions. If this was a chromatogram, you would say it was a partially resolved peak. There are two different subjects within this data, one at 2017 and one at 2020. Now, I'm going to take this further and explain some of why this has occurred by looking at these graphs. So these represent attributable, legible, the ALCOA terms, and how often each of those terms appeared in warning letters. So some terms like contemporaneous, original, and accurate, those have been quite common in FDA warning letters for some time, but the other two have only appeared in a very sharp focus, specifically at 2020. So one question you might think is, well, does that mean that we can look at warning letters from that time and look at specific examples where the FDA have cited a company for attributable? And the answer is no. When you dig into the detail, round about that time, the FDA changed their boilerplate for remediation, and they started to include the need to have data that's attributable, legible, complete within the remediation action. So the peak in the contemporaneous of 2020 is because of that, whereas the other peak at 2017 is that peak of focusing on data integrity in the laboratory generally. So with that said, I'm going to go back to the table of contents, and I'm going to hand back over to Bob.
Okay, thanks very much. If you can move on to the next slide, please, Paul. I do this without moving my hand, so voice only. So the PICS guidance, it's interesting. The human gestation period is 9 months. Whales have 22 months, but PICS requires 5 years. But this is a guidance document, and you can see from the arrow on the left how the draft has expanded over time. Next slide, please, Paul. And PICS is actually the Gmp Inspectors Club. There's 54 members. And essentially, the key thing is in the guidance, the name of the guidance document. There are PE, PICS External, written by the inspectors for industry, or PI documents written by regulators for regulators. This one, they allow industry to look at because it's also important for industry to understand where the inspectors are coming from. But one of the guidance documents that they don't have or don't allow industry to look at is the guidance document for how to access audit trails in some of the key chromatography data systems that are commonly found in GMP laboratories. But they talk about data governance, which re-emphasizes Paul's comment earlier. It is the foundation of data integrity. And one of those elements is data ownership, but it's also management leadership. So one of the key things is making certain that the data are owned by a key person, and also the integrity of that data is ensured. Next slide, please, Paul. And we come back to this particular comment that is early in the program. Oh, one other thing I should say is that the PICS guidance says this is not enforceable by regulation. Yes and no. There is nothing in the PICS guidance that relates directly to US GMP. On the other hand, there is explicit phrasing that relates directly to European Union and PICS GMP, things like Annex 11, Chapter 4. So be very careful in your interpretation. But what we want to think about is these two particular components: a supplier who understands data integrity and regulatory requirements and can develop software with the technical controls that ensure both data integrity and compliance. And so Paul and I were writing one of my Focus on Quality articles a couple of years ago. And one of the things we wanted to do was perhaps identify a couple of, a few 483s and warning letter citations for infrared. Next slide, please, Paul. And we analyzed, and we were absolutely amazed to find this is a summary of 104 different 483 observations and warning letters. You'll find the original paper on the web, but it's spectroscopy from 2019. And what I want to focus on, if you can advance the animation such as I use, the key thing is on the left-hand side in yellow. As soon as if you've not done a good evaluation of the software, before you place the purchase order, there's a 40% chance that you're going to get a 483 because no data integrity controls, no audit trail, and no ability to protect records. So some of the things are obviously no audit trail is a major problem, but failure to protect records. If you've got the design of the system with just data stored in directories in the database, in the operating system, it is possible for someone to go round the back of the application into Windows and just delete whatever records you want. And the point we would really make is if you don't evaluate software properly, it perpetuates your data integrity problem. And one of the key points here is come the end of your financial year, you may have an end of year slush fund spend where the manager pops their head around the corner and said, oh, we've got $1 gazillion to spend. Any ideas? This gives you 4 weeks to raise 3 quotes, raise the purchase order, place the PO, and have an empty box delivered in your stores. Not the best way to go about ensuring you've got the right system for the right job. Next slide, please, Paul. Looking on the operational side, we have some issues around everyone's got admin privileges. You haven't set up access control properly. There's no audit trail review, and you wouldn't believe it, in this day and age, raw data still defined as paper. There's been a level 2 guidance on the FDA's website now for 12 years, and no one's read it. And also, it is the case in the FDA's data integrity guidance from 4 years ago. That is as dead as the dodo, but people still ignore it. Next slide, please. I'd like to look at a few more regulatory troubles. Now, there's always the English is a very poor language when it comes to this. The Germans have an excellent word, and that's called Schadenfreude. And Schadenfreude is basically taking pleasure in the misfortune of others. So let's go down the Schadenfreude trail and look at 3 FDA warning letters. And this is 2 that appeared in July 2020. One for Pharmaceutical and one for Tender Corporation. Both US companies, both cited under different parts of the CFR. And you think, well, so what? But the remediation required was almost word for word identical in the 2 warning letters. Next slide, please, Paul. And really one of the questions I would ask is FDA losing patience with companies failing to get current. Next slide, please, Paul. And one of the things, this is a detailed explanation. I wrote an article in my Focus on Quality column in Spectroscopy a couple of years ago, and this goes down into a lot of detail about these 2 warning letters. And this is mandated corrective action, okay? And one of the things I want to focus on is down in the bottom left-hand corner, interfacing standalone instruments to the LIMS network. Now, it used the word network, and one of the key things here was that you can use any applications, and we'll look at this a little bit later. But the underlying message is get rid of paper. Okay, so let me move on to the 3rd warning letter. And this is one that was published in August last year to BBC Group. And the one area that I want to focus on, if you can, is focus on paper and electronic records are not available. Now, this is a fascinating warning letter for this particular citation. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Right. So here's the citation. You didn't retain all original dynamic records obtained during the course of testing. Well, okay. But it focuses on a viscometer used in product release and a UV vis that it was used in raw materials testing. And it had, both of these instruments had the capability to save data, but the company didn't do it. And this is, the capability was there, but the company did not turn on the ability to store electronic records. And this is one of the things that now you start to see a tightening of the letter of the way the companies are being inspected. So let's look briefly at the a summary of these 3 warning letters. So it's understanding your processes. If you look at the station and tender warning letters, there is the requirement to look at the processes and assess the data vulnerabilities. And then consequently from that, you've got to identify, manage those vulnerabilities, and there are 2 approaches required. If you know there's a problem, put in an interim fix, and then also look at long-term solutions. So in terms of the station and tender warning letters, it is fix what you've got now or put some band-aids on it, and then get long-term solution by getting rid of the paper. But one of the things that came out from the station and tender warning letters is that management were deficient in the fact that they didn't understand the warning, the IT systems, and they didn't manage to push remediation earlier in the process. And what they've ended up with is an amazingly high bill. And we'll come on to this in 2 slides. But more than that, it is the requirement that if you have the capability to store and manage electronic data, if you don't enable it, you're going to get clobbered by a citation. And simple instruments connected to a LIMS network, and all this comes about is understanding the C in CGMP. Next slide, please, Paul. If you go to the Federal Register on the 29th of September 1978, in the preamble comment 17 of the CGMPs for 21 CFR 211, there is a detailed explanation of what current means. On the other hand, you probably don't have the 1978 Federal Register in your pocket, and there is also a note on the FDA's website, and it talks about being current. It requires companies to use technologies and systems that are up to date in order to comply with the regulations. The regulations are not static. And what it says explicitly, stuff that was top of the line 10 or 20 years ago may be less than adequate by today's standards. And when I walk around many laboratories, I see what should be in a museum. People don't invest, and the link is there for you to find it on your own and read it and understand it. But it's not just the FDA that requires current. The European Union also works the same way. Take account of scientific and technical progress and introduce changes to enable the medical product to be manufactured and checked by means of generally accepted scientific methods. And what you now have to do is balance the cost of compliance versus the cost of non-compliance. Next slide, please, Paul. And this is shown on this slide. On the left-hand side is the cost of non-compliance, and on the right is the cost of compliance. At the bottom of the graph is the percentage compliant. This is a relative scale. There are only 2 fixed points. You've got nothing, or you're bending over backwards to do everything that is possible to do, and even more besides. The cost of compliance is the cost of doing it right first time. That's shown in green. If you manage risk correctly, you can decide where you want to be on that line, and you can defend it. On the right-hand side is the cost of non-compliance. This is the cost of getting caught if you've done it wrong or done a shoddy job, or indeed not actually improved since the year dot. The cost of compliance is usually a linear scale. The cost of non-compliance is usually a logarithmic scale. And if you doubt that, Shearing-Plough were fined $500 million in about 2002, and Ranbaxy fined $500 million in 2012, both through consent decrees. But, and there's always a but, the interpretation changes over time. Look through 21 CFR 211 and you will find no mention whatsoever of audit trail and their review. However, since 2005 and the Able Laboratories fraud case, every regulator around the globe is wanting review of audit trail entries to ensure things have been done correctly. So interpretation changes over time, and what you thought was defendable a few years ago is now slipping down that the green line to the left, and the increased cost of non-compliance is rising. And what industry normally does is it takes into account what was good enough last inspection is good enough this inspection. That no longer works. Next slide, please, Paul. So let's spend a bit of time looking at poor working practices and not keeping current. Now, to introduce this section, I want to show you my favorite slide from despair.com. Next slide, please. There you go. Tradition. Just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean it's not incredibly stupid. So if you want to dress up in a white suit with a red neckerchief and a sash round your waist and get chased through Pamplona by a bunch of mad bulls, it's entirely up to you. But this slide I introduce whenever I do a process mapping and redesign workshop, because I'm going to challenge people's way of thinking. And so let us start with the gift that keeps on giving, shall we? Here we go. Next. There we go. My favorite topic as an auditor, spreadsheets. Okay. So let's look at a warning letter that is still quite literally hot off the press, 3rd of May this month. Okay. Next. So we go to citation 3, which is a regulatory bog off. And you're probably thinking, what? Buy one, get one free, at least for the inspector. So we start now. Here we go. We're on the slippery slope down to regulatory hell. We start with a non-validated Excel spreadsheet. Now, you wouldn't do this, would you? Please give me some confidence here, please. So we got a non-validated Excel spreadsheet. Well, what did they do? Next bit. Formulas and outputs were printed out. Here we have the stupidity of, well, we printed out the formulae and you can trace it. In this situation, if there's an error, you end up in an Excel Groundhog Day, because you're going to have to enter it all again, correct it, and print it out and have it checked again. And of course, if there's an error and you haven't got the, and you go back and forth, Groundhog Day, remember that. So what didn't they do? They didn't save the original file. You are toast. Okay. So that's the original, that's the spreadsheet. So please, from an auditing perspective, keep using spreadsheets, please. They keep me in business. Next one. So I was doing an audit at the about a year ago, and they've got this lovely Swish fully automated dissolution system. So there's the bath, transfer unit, UV vis software. You pop in the pills at one end and out comes the result at another. Going into more detail, we find they've got 48 analytical procedures, but they only use it automatically 1 out of the 48. The rest of the time, they just throw the pills in, take a sample and manually transfer it to the UV vis, take a reading, and then put the stuff into a unvalidated spreadsheet. I mean, how stupid is that? And of course, management has probably got its head stuck in a place that it shouldn't be stuck in. This is stupid. And what's QA doing? Oh, it looks all right to me, Gov. Right, next slide. This is where I want to introduce you to a chromatography data system that is the world's most expensive electronic ruler. So in green, we have the process, the analytical process. The yellow shows the paper records that are generated, and the blue is the electronic records that are also generated. And in yellow underneath, we have the poor sod that has to do the review and pick up the bill. This is where you find that the review takes longer than the actual analysis. So this lab has got a spreadsheet guru, and anything that can be put into a spreadsheet is. So instead of doing calculations of your system suitability test samples, which comes incidentally free of charge and integrated within the chromatography data system, they print out the paper and type results into a spreadsheet. So, and then on top of that, they type into a different spreadsheet, calibration data and everything else. And of course, when you think things couldn't get worse, they do. You've got the instrument logbooks for the chromatograph and the instrument logbook for the balance, and any other pieces of equipment, perhaps like a pH meter if it's involved in sample prep. What a mess. Next slide, please. And of course, both the PICS guide and the FDA guides fail to keep current with their own regulations, because they say, if you've got a balance or a simple piece of equipment that has a printout, it's static data. It is, but it doesn't end there. You take the data and you type it into a chromatography data system, or indeed a LIMS or anything else. And if you make a mistake, you've got to correct it. So what was static data is now dynamic. Joy of joys. Okay, so let's have a look and see what we should do about essential improvements. So firstly, don't buy rubbish software. Look at both the instrument and the software, but don't just look at it from the ease of use in the lab and how swish and shiny the instrument is. Spend time evaluating the technical controls to ensure compliance. Look at the audit trail. Can you understand it? Look at the system. Is it a standalone workstation, or can you acquire the data directly to the network, because then you in the lab don't have to back it up? Is there a database there which protects the records and has a good audit trail, a good audit trail that will monitor everything? Or is it flat files in directories in the operating system that are vulnerable? So you've got all of these things. And of course, again, I would like to emphasize, this takes time. So if your boss appears around the corner and say, we've got all this money to spend, you're stuffed, because you're going to rush into making a decision. This equipment purchase should be planned properly. Otherwise, you are going to perpetuate your data integrity problems. And also, be also very careful of purchasing. They'll come along and say, yeah, we got the same one or cheaper one off eBay, or I've substituted it. You've done a lot of work and selected the right system with the right technical controls. If purchasing come along and screw the whole thing up to save a few dollars, you're going to run into problem, because if that substitute is actually a poorer system than you've selected, you're going to be paying the bill, because the saving is going to be minuscule compared to the additional cost of further second person review work and any procedural controls you need to put in place. So next slide, please. One of the interesting things is in a now superseded WHO guidance, there is this section which is an amazing piece of advice from a regulatory authority. I would advocate still using this 2016 guidance. The 2021 guidance pales into insignificance compared to this. But it talks about leveraging existing technologies to their full potential. So if you've got a data system that has electronic signature capability and you're not using it, turn it on. Don't print, save time and effort, keep everything within the data system. Listen to this. This is from a regulator. Streamlining data processes, improves data management, improves business process efficiency and effectiveness, reduces cost. What? From a regulator? And facilitating continual improvement. Now, you could imagine this from senior management, but from a regulator, you must be joking. No, it's real, and no one follows it. So you've got to keep current. So what does that mean in practice? Next slide, please, Paul. One of the things we're going to do is exterminate Excel. So we're going to put all the calculations into the chromatography data system. Next slide, please. We're going to eliminate static data. We're going to acquire data from a balance into an instrument data system that we can then transfer to another instrument data system, such as a chromatography data system. This is one option. We can have a lab execution system for the sample preparation data, dilutions, and they all come down, say, into a CDS. There are many ways to do this, but the key point is get rid of data and work electronically. Now, someone's going to turn around and say, oh, what about all this validation? If you're spending a lot of time on validating, you're doing it wrong. You've got to take risk-based approaches to validation. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, over to you for the summary, Squire.
So within this presentation, we've covered themes which have repeated again and again. And one of those themes is around perpetuating problems. And we've seen information from trends and information from warning letters that Bob's presented. And that message is reinforced again, going back to this PICS guidance, where you need to work with your suppliers. And if you find a problem with your suppliers, software or instrument, you need to tell them about it and they need to fix it. And that interaction tells you a lot around the suppliers you choose. And sometimes they can be chosen in some organizations. Procurement can have a strong influence. In some, it's more scientists. So I want to really switch to some more practical, high-level examples that help identify things which perpetuate these data integrity issues. And they're shown here. If you've got complex workflows, they can contribute to problems. And an example would be you've got the capability of doing something electronically, but you print the data out, you manually transcribe that data into another system, perhaps Excel, then you print that out, somebody checks it, and that's a complex process. It takes much longer. So there's a benefit of efficiency, and it perpetuates problems. The UK MHRA data integrity guidance says that if you do anything manually, you have to do a risk assessment to identify and confirm whether it needs witnessing. How many laboratories have a second witness for sample preparation, and how many have done a risk assessment? So some of the guidance is actually offering good advice. Industry needs to look at it. We've got the unusual situation with infrared where there's a skill component. The skill of preparing a sample for infrared, especially if you're doing it by having to grind it and do a unusual mull or a KBR disc, is a skill that not everybody has. And you have to manage that in a compliant way. If the spectrum is poor because of the sample prep, you have to document it, and now you have to keep it. And then, of course, that governance thing that we mentioned at the start, how your governance policy aligns with your data integrity auditing and the audit reviews that you're doing within your software is fundamental to whether that inspector will have a warm, fuzzy feeling when they visit your site, or whether they start to dig in and trench and really look at problems within your lab. So there isn't a universal, if you do this, you will be compliant, because labs are by their very nature complex, and you have a suite. Some software will be more compliant, some software less compliant. What's important is that you know what those risks are, and you have an action plan that's plausible, believable, and resourced, so that in the event of an auditor finding something that's got problems, you're already aware of the problem, and you're hopefully already in the process of doing something. But if you aren't, you can do something in response to the audit. Anything you want to add, Bob, to the concluding slide?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, with
That's
that,
good.
we've got some time to move on to some questions that people hopefully have submitted within the chat, or maybe when they registered. So I'll hand over to Tyler.
Yes, thank you both for presenting today. We have quite a few questions. Just a reminder to everyone, we will be sharing a copy of the presentation and slides, and we're going to have some questions we're not going to get to during the live Q&A. So we'll also have Paul and Bob answer those after the webinar, and we'll send out a PDF response. So first question for you both. A participant would like to know about enforcing data integrity controls in small equipment and devices.
Bob, do you want to make a start?
Yeah, I'll make a start. I think the easiest way, if you take something like a balance pH meter, there's the viscometer example that was in the BBC warning letter. Essentially, the minimum will be to have a printer on it. As an auditor, personally, if you do a reading of a balance by observation, I wouldn't trust it. What I would like to see is, rather than just a printer, is actually to acquire the data electronically, because then you've got automatic contemporaneousness with it's automatically captured. You've got date and time, you've got attribution of action. So things like that would be my view.
So it's difficult because for small systems, it's even possible there isn't a compliant system out there. And that's the dynamic of people need to be very explicit with what they want from their software and from their instrument suppliers. If there isn't a compliant solution, you're going to have to wrap procedural control around that. You may even have to wrap a logbook, and that will give you a temporary way of working. But my interpretation is that the regulators will not accept that workaround indefinitely, even though there may not be an ideal electronic solution available. You need to start to use that as the basis of some of the systems you purchase.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This next question is kind of along the same lines. So how would someone or a company stay data integrity compliant with a legacy equipment?
I think the first thing is to do what virtually MHRA, WHO, and PICS guidances say, is map the process and identify the data and look to see what the vulnerabilities are. The fact, and the PICS guidance makes this very clear, the fact that it's validated does not mean that a system is actually, the data are actually, the integrity is assured. So look at the vulnerabilities, put as many technical controls in place as possible. So perhaps where you say user IDs are shared and everyone's an admin, that's easy to solve from a technical perspective. But where you haven't got an audit trail, as Paul was mentioning just now, you're going to need to put in a logbook or some other mechanism, perhaps in the analytical batch record, to document who has created data, who has modified data, and it's attached with as it's applicable to the batch being analyzed or the data being analyzed at the time. Do you want to add anything, Paul?
Yeah, the word legacy is interesting. So from my spectroscopy background, one of my thought processes historically was, well, if you put into use a mechanical dispersive infrared instrument, there's no software attached, therefore you you don't have to validate the software. Might be a thought process you have. However, if you did that, that would be like an unbelievable red rag to a bull, and the regulator wouldn't accept it because there are systems available that are technically compliant, and they know this. Regulators approached instrument companies and software providers to ask for training so they can understand the data integrity and the technical controls within the software. So they're really savvy at knowing the issues, the good points and the bad points. And often that can mean they can go straight to a system and ask a simple question, and before you know it, they have a problem. So I would avoid the word legacy wherever possible, but really you need to justify continued use of systems that are non-compliant. And it may be that there isn't one available in the world, provided you've addressed that, understood the risks and documented it, so it's very clear you understand the issues and you're managing it, then that will be a lower risk, a much lower risk.
Yeah, and I think if it's really out of date, that you have a plan to replace it, not necessarily tomorrow, although if you've got the boot of the regulator up your in places it shouldn't be put in, you may want to accelerate that. But normally if you said, well, okay, it's in next year's budget and here's the evidence for that, that should be fine. You will pick up the bill for all the procedural controls in the short term.
Okay, thank you both for those answers. This next question, we had quite a few come in on this topic related to using validated Excel spreadsheets, using paper records, and so forth. So this next question, how do you deal with data integrity efforts related to how data is stored? So like storing on the cloud versus USB, CDs, and paper, etc.
Do you want me to take that one, Paul?
You take that one, then I'll see if I can contribute. Okay.
USB sticks, no, don't use unless there is a very good reason for that. There is a lovely warning letter from 2015 where an inspector saw someone by an HPLC machine pulling a USB stick out, and the inspector wanted to see what that was, and the guy ran away, and it was only after remonstrating with management that the alleged USB drive was brought. If you are going to store on CD, they have a finite time. Personally, I wouldn't do it. I change my mind, but there is a NIST special publication 500-242 looks at storage of CDs, and unless you've got the conditions right, you're toast, and so's your data. Going to the cloud is interesting. Yes, you can do it, but it's not the universal panacea. You have to manage a different set of risks. Firstly, data center fires are not unknown. There was a beautiful one in Strasbourg in March of last year, and the owner of the company sent a tweet out at 2:45 in the morning saying, we recommend you invoke your disaster recovery plans. And many of the people suddenly found out that they didn't have backup, as that was an extra. So you need to understand what's happening and where the data is stored, and there's enough resilience and failover for storing it there. Personally, I think the data is probably better stored in the within the application, or being able to be backed up from the application or archived from the application and then brought back in if you need to reprocess. The main reason for that is that data, lab data, are proprietary, and you've got a major problem. You need the application. You can't swap between applications at the moment.
one of the sensitivities in that space is that in order to install validated software on a network, you're then invoking the relationship with IT, where you may be competing with corporate projects for IT time for what is a really important improvement in the lab. So that issue, the sensitivity with IT, can lead to proliferation of use of USB or preventing software that's more compliant being installed. It's a complete headache. There's no universal answer, but if you're either going to wrap a procedural control around it or ideally some software around it, but again, know the risks, make sure you've got a backup, and make sure you've tested your recovery processes.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you both for those insights. We're right at time, but I'm going to ask one final question before we get off today. And the ones that we didn't get to, just a reminder, we will be writing those offline and getting them back to you via email. So this last question is directed at Paul. In your analysis of observations, are you seeing a shift to data quality within context of data integrity?
I'm seeing a shift now. It was like a blunderbuss, the sort of look at everything on data integrity. It focused and harmonized regulators all over the world. They were all trained by Monica and now perhaps Peter Baker. So there was that focus. As that matures, the context of that data integrity sensitivity is becoming something they're focusing on. But you have to get into the 483s and maybe even the EIRs to see that context in detail. You have to do a lot of looking to find the golden nuggets. So yes, I am seeing that, but you have to look for it.
Yes, thank you. All right, everyone, that concludes today's webinar. We will get these questions and recording out to you as soon as possible. Thank you again, Paul and Bob, for presenting with us today. It was very informative.
Thank you all for attending.
Yes.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.